All right, so cell membrane and transport. What's the connection here with these two ideas? We've got the cell membrane and then we've got this need for transport. What are we referring to here? What are we transporting?
Proteins.
We're transporting proteins. Well,
ions.
Transporting, yes, ions. What else are we transporting? Thank you, Sydney. What else might need to be transported into the cell or out of the cell? Someone help us. All right, so this notion here of transport is referring to the need to sort of move things into and out of the cell, right? We're clear that the cell is a living organism, right? And it requires things that are essential for life. So everything from nutrients, oxygen, glucose, these are all requirements for the cell. And so we're clear that the cell membrane serves as this barrier, right? The cell membrane serves as a barrier that separates the outside of the cell, the extracellular environment, from the internal cell environment. All right, so we're going to look today at this concept of how substances are able to permeate this membrane. All right, we have a couple of learning objectives today. We want to look again at this overall structure and makeup of the cell membrane. We've kind of discussed it already, but we'll take another brief look at it, at the actual makeup and structure of this membrane. And we'll look at some transport mechanisms for how we actually get substances into and out of the cell. There are a couple of ways to get these ions and other nutrients and things that we need into the cell. And so we'll take a look at those today. And so we'll start again with the cell membrane, right? The cell membrane is sort of that first barrier of protection, okay? It acts as a barrier to regulate entry and exit, okay? It's regulating entry and exit of substances, products, molecules, ions into the cell, okay? Structurally, this cell membrane consists of a phospholipid bilayer, right? We established this structure as a phospholipid bilayer that has proteins embedded throughout, right? And so this phospholipid bilayer sort of behaves as this 2D fluid structure for which proteins and lipids can diffuse across, okay, and other substances, all right? And so the major component of this phospholipid bilayer, right, that our membrane is arranged in is the phospholipid, all right? You need to write this down. This phospholipid is a very important structure. It's a type of a lipid. It's a special type of lipid that has this sort of head-tail arrangement, all right? And this phospholipid, again, it arranges itself into two sheet-like structures, right? These leaflets, right? So two sets of sheets where the heads are both facing outward, right? And the tails are facing each other on the inside, right? And so we get this this bilayer structure forming, okay? So we have these two layers of sheets of phospholipids, all right? We've got the polar heads that are facing outward, so they're facing the aqueous environment and the extracellular component as well as inside of the cell, right? And then we have those two layers of tails interacting together, sort of forming this hydrophobic interior. So if we looked at the structure of this phospholipid bilayer in sort of a linear arrangement, this is what we have, right? So structurally, this is a phospholipid right here, all right? If you saw this molecule, you should be able to identify it as a phospholipid, where we've got this polar hydrophilic head. Write this down. A characteristic of the phospholipid is that it's amphipathic, all right? So it has both a polar component and a non-polar component, all right? This polar head is going to have a hydrophilic interaction, which means it's going to readily interact with water, right? Conversely, these non-polar tails are hydrophobic, all right? And so these tails are going to be buried on that inner arrangement of this phospholipid bilayer away from the water. All right, so if we looked at it from a linear standpoint, this is a phospholipid bilayer. All right, if I ask you to describe the structure of the cell membrane, you're going to tell me that it is a phospholipid bilayer that has various proteins dispersed throughout this membrane for the purpose of transport and signal transduction and anchoring and so forth. And we'll talk about some of the roles of these proteins. But suffice it to say, embedded throughout this phospholipid bilayer are proteins. All right, these proteins are interacting with the membrane in various arrangements. We'll have integral and peripheral proteins depending on how they are embedded throughout the membrane. But right now, your goal is to understand the structure of this membrane, and its major makeup is going to be the phospholipid, right, with proteins embedded throughout. All right, and so structurally, so like if we looked at the cell, so when we draw the cell in the classroom and we're on the whiteboard, we just kind of use this 1D circle to illustrate a cell. All right, but if we looked at it from sort of a 2D analyses, we can see then that there are two layers of lipids. We've got one layer out here, right? And then we've got another layer right here, all right? And so this is inside of the cell. The internal compartment of the cell is an aqueous environment, as well as the extracellular environment, all right? So these polar heads are going to be facing our aqueous environments, meaning it's a liquid. All right, where we got these hydrophobic tails embedded on the inside of that bilayer and not coming in contact with water. What questions do we have about this structure? Any questions? Okay. So I mentioned that the cell membrane is made up of phospholipids, and it also has proteins embedded throughout the membrane. All right. Those proteins that are embedded throughout the membrane have a number of functions that are essential for the cell. All right. I mentioned transport. All right. This concept of transport is essential. All right, because the membranes that are present are going to help to facilitate the passage of materials through that membrane, right? So we said that membrane is referred to sort of as a fluid mosaic, right? So it's not this static structure that's impenetrable. It is penetrable, but it's selectively penetrable or permeable, okay? Some text that you read might use the term permeable, all right? So we write this down. We refer to the cell membrane as being a selectively permeable barrier, in that, again, it's going to be very selective in the passage of substances, okay? The materials, nutrients, the ions, the gases, all of these things are gonna need a way for permeating this membrane, and transport proteins can facilitate that, okay? If these are the larger, more complex substances that cannot readily diffuse across the membrane. So we have jot a few of these functions down of our protein, of our membrane proteins. They regulate transport, or they facilitate transport. They play a role in communication, all right? So detecting environmental signals, so signal transduction, all right? These membrane proteins facilitate communication between cells and the environment, okay? Facilitate communication between other cells, all right? Structural support, all right? These membrane proteins can provide structural support in terms of anchoring or attaching that membrane to the cell cytoskeleton, and just providing that overall structural aspect of the cell. All right, and so these functions are all very important. All right, if we look at these images, this image that I have here, we're representing some of the functions of the membrane proteins. All right, so transport, again, these membrane embedded proteins can function as channels or gateways for us to transport larger organic and inorganic substances across this membrane, all right? So this part right here represents our lipid bilayer, right? And these are various types of proteins that can be embedded. So they function as transporters, they function as receptors, okay, for signal transduction. All right, so transmitting signals from the environment to the internal component. So signal transduction is important. Enzymatic activity, so chemical reactions take place at the cell membrane surface, okay, as well as anchoring, okay, attachment to that cytoskeleton. All right, so these are all very important functions of membrane proteins. All right, any questions about that? Is this recording? Yes. Okay. Again, this is just another schematic to illustrate some of the functions of membrane proteins. All right. Read in this diagram, we have this sort of peach area representing the internal cell inside the cell. This blue represents the outside of the cell. And this structure right here represents our lipid bilayer, the cell membrane. All right, so we've got proteins embedded in the cell membrane that functions as channels or openings or pores or gateways in order for us to get large substances into the cell. Again, the enzymatic activity here. All right, so chemical reactions can take place. We know that enzymes are responsible for aiding or speeding up the rate of chemical reactions. Signal transduction. Again, we've got these proteins here that function as receptors to receive signals from the environment in order for a response to take place. All right. Cell-cell recognition. So again, interactions and communications with adjacent cells. Intercellular joining. So attachment to different cells to form tissues or other structures. And then we have attachment. All right, so again, we're trying to anchor and attach this cell to the cytoskeleton, the membrane to the cytoskeleton of the cell. So many different functions of membrane proteins that are essential for the survival of our cells. All right. So let's look at some types of transport. How do we get these substances and nutrients and things that we need into the cell? All right, so this concept of transport is important. And I mentioned the term selectivity. All right, the cell is going to be very selective about what substances and nutrients can enter the cell and when. All right, it's going to be in response to conditions. All right, environmental conditions, intracellular conditions. Okay, but this need or idea of transport is essential for cell survival. Why? All right, this is how cells are going to acquire the nutrients that it requires, okay, or needs. All right, this transport is going to allow for the removal of waste. All right, so we're understanding this is a living organism, right? It requires nutrients, and in turn, it's going to generate waste. So we've got to have ways and mechanisms to remove this waste from the cell. Okay, we've got to have a way for, again, communication and signaling. Okay, so these transport activities are going to facilitate the transmission of signals to neighboring cells. All right. The two main modes of transport, of membrane transport, are diffusion and osmosis. Okay, jot these down: diffusion and osmosis. Okay, by definition, we're going to say diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. You need to know this definition. Okay, diffusion is a process of it's a passive process that does not require an input of energy. Okay, but it is in fact the movement, this random movement of molecules is based on random motion. Okay, and so as this image illustrates, it's going to move from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. All right, so this diffusion is going to happen in a random fashion, and it's basically going to be this random movement of these molecules, random motion, until a state of equilibrium is reached. Okay, this picture right here shows diffusion in a in a beaker, if you will. All right, where we've got these molecules all concentrated in one area, right? But due to random motion, these particles are going to disperse randomly until a state of equilibrium is reached. Okay. Likewise, osmosis is the movement of water, okay, across this semi-permeable barrier, right? And that's what our cell membrane represents, a semi-permeable membrane, right? And this water molecules are going to move from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. Okay. Again, this is a form of passive transport, and by definition, passive transport does not require an input of energy. It's going to be due to random motion, right? So if we took a look then at our cell membrane and how substances can pass through, or which substances can pass through, there are some substances that can move easily across that cell membrane. I thought I had a different structure of the cell membrane. Substances like water or gases, they're going to be able to move by way of this passive transport. Okay, osmosis and diffusion. Okay, so those gases that the cell might require, like oxygen, for example, can easily permeate the cell membrane. Okay, water is sort of an anomaly in that it is polar. Like typically we have these non-polar substances that can move easily, but water, although it's polar, it can also move through this phospholipid bilayer structure without any assistance. All right, and so again, we're envisioning the arrangement of this phospholipid, right? It's these two layers of lipids where substances may or may not be able to penetrate it easily. On the other hand, so while there are these small polar molecules and gases that can pass easily, others require a different mode of transport. Okay, larger, more complex molecules require facilitation to penetrate or permeate that cell membrane. Okay, and those are active transport mechanisms. Okay, active transport mechanisms are going to move substance from a lower concentration to a higher concentration, and up that concentration gradient, it's going to require an input of energy. Okay, jot that down. It's going to require an input of energy in order for active transport to occur. What questions do we have about this? Okay, any questions? All right, so you should definitely be able to sort of compare and contrast passive and active forms of transport and why these modes exist. What are they each used for? and examples. Okay, so these active modes of transport, again, are us attempting to transport these larger organic molecules like our glucose and other things that the cell needs, sodium. But these oxygen molecules, for example, it's easily permeates the cell by way of passive diffusion. Okay. We have these membrane proteins that are embedded here that also facilitates the passage of materials through active transport. Okay. We see some examples of facilitated diffusion here and active transport where substances can actually bind to these membrane proteins and be transported across the membrane. Okay. What questions do you all have about this information? Any questions?